We are coming together as the Rise Together National Network and a regional retreat of the Northern California and Southern California cohorts. Dr. Young Lee, who is the coordinator of Southern California, and myself, Valerie Miles Tribble, as coordinator of Northern California, thought that it would be a good idea to bring our cohorts together so that the women could meet and be able to engage interculturally and hopefully to find out that even though we celebrate each other's distinctions, there's much in common in our stories that we need to hear and appreciate. And so our theme for our regional conference is cross-cultural mentoring, overcoming contextual silos. One of the things that the National Network through the Lilly Grant has wanted to do is to bring together a diverse group of women. And so often in our work settings, in our ministry settings, we find ourselves siloed, as we were talking about over at our various dinner tables. And it is incumbent upon us to make an effort to find a way to overcome those silos. And so the specific topic of this evening's panel is navigating the hegemonic norms of whiteness and patriarchy. Navigating the hegemonic norms of whiteness and patriarchy. As you know, we are living in a very volatile time right now, where everywhere you turn, you hear the phrase, "Make America Great Again." And that phrase tends to signify a lifting up or superiority of whiteness over the diversity of our country with all the different cultures and experiences that we have. And so as people of color, and for our brothers who are here with us as sisters, as brothers and sisters of color, if we don't make a concerted effort to come together, to appreciate each other, then we will fall victim to the myth of whiteness and patriarchy. And so it gives me great pleasure to moderate this wonderful panel of women who are leaders in their own right. And I want to introduce them to you. Sophia Magallanes, in the middle, is assistant professor of theology and biblical studies at Life Pacific University, located in San Dimas, California. And she earned a BA in biblical studies from Azusa Pacific, an MA in biblical studies from Azusa Pacific, and an MA in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. And as if that's not enough, a Ph.D. in Divinity with an emphasis in Hebrew Scriptures and Old Testament from the University of Edinburgh. And she specializes in Hebrew poetry and wisdom literature, Old Testament studies, Hebrew and Greek, and she's authored several articles and in the midst of publications currently. So, Sophia, we look forward to hearing from you as a Latina, from your perspectives and lived experience. And then to Sophia's right, we have Jeanne Ko, and Jeanne also has a stellar bio. She is a PhD, she has her PhD degree. She's a second-generation Korean American who grew up in my home city of Philadelphia, in the greater Philadelphia area, and she's lived most of her life on the East Coast. She holds a BA in English Literature from Swarthmore College, MDiv, and a Master of Theology from Princeton Theological Seminary, and a doctorate in Christian Theology and Ethics from Duke University Divinity School. And her research has focused on the intersections between theology, religious studies, race, and gender, particularly in their modern and contemporary context. And she is exploring, in her first monograph, she explores how theological analysis of self-sacrifice mimic and disrupt interpretations of sacrifice as racial capital in the U.S. context. She is a member of PC USA, and she's currently serving as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California in Irvine. So these ladies are studied and learned in that which they speak. Say amen, somebody. Amen. All right. And last but not least, on the other side of Sophia, we have Reverend Dr. Sarai Craine. And Sarai completed her MDiv at San Francisco her MDiv at Pacific School of Religion, the Graduate Theological Union in the Bay Area, and then her Doctor of Ministry at San Francisco Theological Seminary, also part of the GTU. And Sarai is serving as the executive director after many years, let me just say after many years of serving in pastoral ministry in at least 2 churches. She then took her ministry because she saw a need of working with women who have been victimized by abuse and rape. And so her ministry currently is serving as the executive director of Bay Area Women Against Rape. And so in that capacity, she trains staff for crisis intervention, works with the board, is a community collaborator with law enforcement, and moves around the country not only to preach and teach, but also to conduct training. So these ladies were asked specifically for their backgrounds in advocating for women, and also for their backgrounds in having to navigate themselves in this fabric and arena that we're talking about. And so I'm going to ask them questions, and we'll dialogue about each question and then go to the next, and we'll make sure that we allow time for question and answers at the end. The first question under this topic of navigating the hegemonic norms of whiteness and patriarchy is specifically focuses on I don't speak white. So please discuss how hegemonic presumptions of whiteness are laid upon women of color with the expectations of living up to standards that ignore or downplay our distinct identities. Appreciate your speaking to that, whoever feels led, and I will guide that discussion if needed. Who would like?
So before I begin, so I kind of wasn't sure what to expect. So I'm a manuscript speaker, so I hope you will bear with me as I kind of read some of the reflections that I had in response to these questions. But before I begin, I wanted to thank Drs. Valerie Miles Tribble and Youngly Hertig for extending the invitation for all of us to speak on this panel tonight. And I also wanted to express how honored I am to be sharing this space with my co-panelists. So I realize that my context may be very different from yours, who are working in churches, seminaries, and advocacy organizations and other ministries. And learning more about Rise this evening from just sitting with the people at the table around me, and learning about some of the work that you're already involved in, I think that some of you should actually be speaking tonight, not me. But I also think that there are opportunities for translation between your context and mine in what I have to share today. More specifically, in my own experience, I have found that my research has helped me understand how certain ways of being have become naturalized in our different settings. So it's allowed me to ask questions about whether things can, in fact, be different. So the truth is, I do know how to speak white. While my parents may have spoken to me in Korean when I was a baby, English was the language that I remember growing up speaking. At the time, the thinking was that if you spoke a language aside from English, you fall behind at school. So this isn't to say that I always spoke correct American English. I remember adjusting the pronunciations of napkin and pull because I realized that I wasn't saying them in the standard English, but with the pronunciation of immigrant Korean English. The extra vocabulary and reading comprehension lessons that I did, in addition to my homework, all did their work to try and create distance between myself and my ethnic heritage. At the same time, I can't necessarily say I was whitewashed. Rather, all of this was part of my growing up with immigrant parents who wanted what was best for me. Speaking and writing English correctly, or white, was part of providing me with a range of opportunities precisely as the daughter of Korean immigrant parents. At the same time, it's also true that I've been confronted with backlash from this. I have heard from a well-intentioned white seminary professor that I was, quote, more articulate and well-spoken, end quote, than other Asian American women. I was asked by another whether I was born in this country because, quote, your English is so good, you don't have an accent, end quote. These comments weren't unfamiliar to me, but the fact that I heard them in a seminary setting was unsettling and disillusioning. Finding my faith in the Korean immigrant and then Asian American church, I didn't realize that Christianity and the rhythms of Christian tradition could feel so alien to me. So part of the way I tried to cope was to try and beat them at their own game. I went to seminary because I loved theology. I found that I loved both systematic theology, especially the theology of Karl Barth. I did go to Princeton after all. But also what were called contextual theologies. I wanted to think and do my theology in conjunction with my Asian American identity, and a deep part of me refused to think that I needed to do one without the other. To be completely honest, it was a lonely endeavor. Most of the other students at the time who were interested in Barth were white, male students, freshly arriving from their evangelical colleges, while I had worked for some time before going back to school. And when the time came for me to apply to doctoral programs, my well-intentioned white, male mentor was supportive, but also expressed skepticism that my two interests could be held together in a generative manner. Even James Cone, he argued, received his training in Barth before writing his Black theology. It was only after that I started my doctoral studies at Duke that I began to extricate myself from the pressures of speaking in a white man's voice, a voice that I'd subtly but increasingly associated with doing theology in the right way. It's only been through the experiences of many years of being surrounded by mentors, friends, and colleagues who pushed me to explore my interests that I've been able to start reflecting on how whiteness has been the invisible partner undergirding much of what we conceive of as Christian theology and ethics. It's not to say that Christian theology and ethics in itself is right, but that it is presented in and thought through in such a way to undergird whiteness. So as a way to frame what I've shared so far, I want to talk about two ways that this invisible whiteness reveals itself by referring to two qualities of whiteness that the critical theorist Sarai has described. One, whiteness is a matter of orienting bodies towards itself so that certain objects are to be reached for and not others. So by objects, Ahmed doesn't just mean physical objects, but also styles, capacities, aspirations, techniques, habits. So speaking in the language of theology meant that some theology was real theology, scholastic and oriented toward Western philosophy, and some was not, Asian American theology or other theologies of color. It meant that because I did not look white, that I instead needed to appear white in my discourse, in a calculus of fear and inadequacy. 2, Ahmed talks about how this orientation is embodied through habits and in space. And what I take this to mean in this context is that many seminary professors and administrators are white. Many of the voices that are centered are white. And we notice when persons of color are administrators or professors because they are not white. But I think that Asian Americans in the academy occupy a strange space for many because we are not expected to rock the boat or push for structural change. We are not white, but we are white. For my well-intentioned seminary professors, I proved an exception to the rule because I had somehow, in their eyes, successfully disassociated myself from the trappings of ethnic language and ways of being. But it was precisely in that very affirmation that I realized clearly that I was, in fact, not white, but Asian American. So what I have tried to excavate in my work is how these modes of whiteness still exist, not only in the theological canon per se, but also within ourselves.
Thank you so much for that. I will preface this by saying the first and only time in my life that I've ever been referred to as a white American was when I lived in Edinburgh. And because they couldn't tell the difference between a Hispanic American accent and just an American accent in general. And they saw the color of my skin, so they said, "You're a white American." But all of the men who were in the Ph.D. program with me at the University of Edinburgh, there were about 27 men entering with me, the only female, all from North America. They all looked to me as if I did not belong and that I should just go back home to America or to Mexico. But all that I also wrote something out. And it's going to be a little bit shorter. Speaking white is not merely about making sure you don't have an accent while speaking English. It is also about editing yourself so as not to say anything that makes white colleagues feel uncomfortable. If I do open up and share an actual story about my life or my family of origin, most colleagues are uncomfortable or they look at me as if I'm trying to tell a sob story. As a light-skinned Latina, often I can pass as white, but I have to keep my mouth shut. The way I look gives me greater access to white spaces, but unfortunately, this gives me access to unfiltered racism. At my institution of employment, many times, it is hard to express what I'm experiencing in the way of tokenism and presumed incompetence. Even when my mentors and colleagues eventually realize my level of competence, there remains a challenge of presumed incompetence in the classroom by students. Women of color already have the double disadvantage, and this is amplified in a context where the woman of color teaches Bible or assumes spiritual authority. In an article called Unfulfilled Promise, Women and Academia, Pleck observes that faculty and students of all ethnicities and genders may feel threatened when their colored female colleague acts like a serious intellectual rather than a mascot, cheerleader, or seductress. I've experienced this statement to be true more often than not. I'm fully aware that my colleagues and students are most comfortable with me when I am maternal, and even fill the classroom and the boardroom with lively stories, music, and food. I've come to grips with the fact that they can only receive my expertise when I lower their guard by using subversive tactics. Because I play into their stereotypes, I know that they don't take what I do seriously. Be that as it may, I am strategic about everything I do in the classroom and have research to back up my use of food, music, and even humor as tools of pedagogy. Sorry. My working identity, as it is called, with critical race theorists refer to a person of color's working identity. My working identity is this. It's compatible with the stereotypes and yet subversive to the stereotypes, because I feel that I have a job to do, and the job is to educate. And I'll do whatever I can to educate the people that God has entrusted to me. I'm going to leave it at that.
So my context that I would bring to this conversation has to do with my experience working in ministry in the context of pastoral, being in full-time vocational ministry, and then while I was in seminary, being exploited in ministry for several years for free. And recognizing what it was like to transition from being in seminary to serving in an urban church context, and then going into a multicultural congregation, large multicultural congregation in Silicon Valley, and what it meant to navigate those spaces as a young Black woman, and feeling that pressure around just very problematic but pervasive angry Black women tropes. Mm-hmm. And so, I've been told by colleagues, I was one of 2 women on a pastoral staff of 17, that I needed to tone down, because I sounded a little too Oakland, too ghetto, and just needed to tone down some of who I am and what brought the experiences that I brought. And so that question around speaking white has been a conversation that has been in my experience in ministry, and even before that, because for Black people, that idea and notion of whiteness and the complication that has within our community is really, really complicated, problematic, and it can apply a lot of pressure. And so, I'm 4th generation college graduate and postgraduate. My great-grandmother held a doctorate, my grandmother had a master's degree, my mother has 2 master's degrees. So my experience was never, that I was the first one in my family to go to college. So that idea of what it meant to speak like you had some sense, or speak like you weren't from the hood, that there was a lot of pressure around that. And so I think exploring ideas and notions around code switching was a huge theme and topic, and that was just imparted to me as wisdom, but it also challenged the ways that I was showing up, either as authentic or not. And because I have served in poor, broken churches and also highly traumatized, vulnerable populations, sometimes it just would have created more of a barrier. And I learned that very early on in ministry, that some of the pressure that had been applied, in just navigating professional life, navigating church contexts which were, dominated by white supremacy, and in Black churches where white supremacy had not been dismantled, even though they would never acknowledge that. Hello, somebody. And recognizing that it was that even the way that I spoke would create a barrier, but then being challenged by peers and colleagues to not sound too regular, right? That there was a distinction between what it meant to do functional ministry and have a practical ministry, heart and real sense of calling, versus feeling like called or centered in the academy. So there's just been it's just been a complicated journey. And so I think that the reality is white supremacy is dominant in many of our, ethnic spaces. And I think being honest about that has to be, it's been really challenging and dangerous, right? Because I'll just say this, I don't know if it's appropriate to say this at this point, I know we're going to go on and talk about a couple other things, but what I have recognized, and I've served in spaces that were, in church contexts that were homogenous Black churches, in multicultural churches, and also now serving in nonprofit where people of color are the least served, or the least represented in leadership, but sometimes the most, vulnerable. And are navigating systems that are historically white, with law enforcement, the judicial system, and the medical system. So there's just a lot of complication there. But what I have found is that I'm speaking from my experience and pain serving in the Black church, where you'll see this real passion around how we are raising and centering race and, dismantling racism, but those same individuals will oppress and marginalize women who are serving and not looking at that as a tool of whiteness and white supremacy. And so it's just, there's a lot of pain within the community and the conversation. And again, because now I'm enacting my ministry within the context of, the anti-violence movement and navigating spaces with law enforcement, with the judicial system, and, in the medical profession where you have folks who are not accessing these systems because of white supremacy. The ways that folks are or are not reporting violence against them, where they're not, this isn't something that happened years ago, which is still relevant in terms of my sense of urgency around intervention, but actively experiencing harm, being exploited in homes where there is harm, and yet feeling that they cannot access services or will not be treated with the same dignity and respect because of white supremacy. And so I've given myself permission to name it as it is, okay? Just name it, it's white supremacy. And, many of us, we're generations beyond, and so, calling to some level of accountability the ways that white supremacy is showing up even among the individuals that I've been called to serve alongside of, that have given me wise counsel, that have tried to mentor me, but they're moving and functioning in that ethic of white supremacy as well. And so I've had to take responsibility for the ways that I was even showing up in spaces as a leader, because I am serving in a capacity now where my current role, I'm the first Black executive of the entire agency in 49 years. And I've shared that with folks, and they're like, "Oh wow, congratulations!" But it's really actually pitiful because the agency has been, it's located and founded in the Bay Area. It's the oldest rape crisis agency in the nation. The previous executive director, who was extraordinarily white, had been there for 37 years. And so at the time I took over the helm in 2016, just looking at the ways that that some of the toxicity and dysfunction was showing up, and the ways that white privilege was showing up, was really a problem. And I inherited the problem, but still felt the pressure of not sounding too angry. Even though I was cleaning up the wounds that had been created by white people before me. Well, but if I spoke too Black, and if I was too direct, so then if I was too assertive and too direct, then I sounded angry. And then, so now I'm tiptoeing around what that means. And then dealing with the white fragility of the people who were still on staff and felt real, sensitive and fragile around the ways that they were perpetuating and benefiting from white supremacy as it was shown with the agency as well. So it's been very, very complicated. And again, I am committed to calling it out and being unapologetic. So even as I've re-envisioned the agency and made some shifts and have reorganized, I'm calling it out. And yeah, I've had to check myself around the areas where I've been angry, because I have every right to be angry. We should be. And for folks that, question me about it, I'm like, why aren't you? So I think I'll pause there, because I know that we'll be tapping on some other things as we go further.
Thank you. So as you can see, we have come to speak real time. And I want to just note that when Young Lee and Dr. Young Lee and I were trying to put this symposium together, we had some objectives. So I want to share those real quickly so you won't be wondering why these topics and why do we need to hear them. The one objective was to bring together, of course, the mentees of Northern California and Southern California to encourage and foster camaraderie. The next one was to generate cross-cultural dialogue while exploring intersectional issues that impact ministry, whether your ministry is in church, a parachurch, or nonprofit community service, to hear and appreciate contextual perspectives of sharing our stories. The third was to obtain feedback from the mentees in attendance about the value of joint engagement to overcome cross-cultural differences, and we will be focusing more on that tomorrow. And of course, the fourth one was to support and strengthen the Rise Together network through its national and regional scope. So in light of those objectives, our second area for discussion that we would like to pose to the panelists involves intracultural dynamics in our churches, in the academy, and societally. Ladies, please speak, or sisters, please speak to the presumptions or even stereotypes. Some of you were touching on this, but please speak to the presumptions or even stereotypes of women serving in institutions in leadership roles and valuing our voices and contributions.
My experience and observation over, the last several years has been that even now in 2019, the expectation is that female-identified folk that are serving in the context of ministry, and as we're enacting our ministries in other spaces, that we are the nurturers, and, the folks who are doing children's ministry. So when I took over. So let me just say, when I was in full-time vocational ministry serving in the large multicultural church, at that point I was so excited. It was this big, thriving, enterprise. There was so much going on. And from a leadership standpoint, I was just thankful for the ways that I felt like the ministry just really operated with, high level of excellence. I had been serving in a church where I was licensed and ordained, where we would, we was at church for 3 hours. So by the time I got to the multicultural church, the white people, they did 75 to 90 minutes. I was like, this is the will of God for my life. So by the time I got there, I was like, what? We can get all this done in 75 minutes? Like, it just seemed amazing. But when I got there, there would be these real, not so subtle ways of just the patriarchy. So the shock that I wasn't the new children's pastor or the new youth pastor, the shock that I was at the Graduate Theological Union, or that I had, been highly credentialed at the time. I was the highest credentialed on exec staff outside of the senior pastor, who was the founder pastor. And just the oh wow, you're so articulate. Like, so those little digs, those little shots, because the assumption was, and it was never really the expectation that I was showing up in the space as the leader or as the individual that had authority. I can't tell you how many weddings I've officiated where I show up and they, where I've been questioned. Once I had my robe on and one of the groomsmen asked me if I graduated earlier. And I was like, what? And he just could not understand why I had a robe on until I said, well, I'm actually going to be officiating. Shocked, unbelievable, couldn't believe it. But even those types of things, not just in community, though, that was happening at the church. And, my brothers, who were supposed to be, my brothers, they were really just benevolent sexists. They thought they were doing me a favor by, benevolent sexists. So you call me your sister, but ultimately you will never see me as an equal, even though it was my intelligence that would be called upon and my hard work that would be called upon in times of crisis and real legitimate crisis intervention. The senior pastor stepped down citing moral failure within the context of his marriage. You're talking 7,000 members. The elders, that was all male, started off at the church as a co-ed board of trustees, which switched it to an all-male board of elders. So when this man stepped down citing moral failure within the context of his ministry, there was absolutely no plan. So who got called? Me. But I could not qualify as one of the people on the board of elders because I was female. And so it's like, so you can pimp me for my intellect and for my strategy, because I'm the one who laid out the blueprint and the strategy for how we were going to roll it out and what we were going to do in crisis intervention, and the first person that preached the weekend after the massive split. And we're talking thousands of people, but I'm not qualified to be an elder. And so those are the kinds of things that happen all the time, where women are the helpmeets, where we are the ones who are called in these spaces by our patriarchal, sexist brothers who love us the best that they know how and the best that they've been taught. But they've also been taught and led and mentored by other men who are experiencing the privilege of operating in that way. And so, you know, I thought fleeing from that and going into nonprofit was going to be somehow better. But what do you think happened when the Oakland police scandal hit? When these officers are being exposed for sexual exploitation, who's being called? We need training. Will you come in and do training with us? And you know, it's always come fix up, come clean up, and put your cape on and take all the shots, even though we don't pay you like a woman, or not pay you at all because you're my sister. You know, do me this solid. It's happened over and over and over again. And I think when I was younger in ministry, I tolerated it a lot more. Now I'm just frustrated and I have the language to articulate it with a little less steam. See, I can say pimp in this space if that's all right. Yeah. But that's the kind of passion that comes from that. So I'll stop.
All right. You just gave me some freedom. Speak a little bit more, like, freely. So, it's so awesome to hear about the legacy of your grandmother. And, yeah, my grandmother she's half Navajo. She grew up in New Mexico. She never went to school because she had, she's the oldest daughter of 18 brothers and sisters. And so she didn't need to go to school, right? And then my mother only has a 6th grade education. My dad went to secondary school in Mexico. He's from Para, Chihuahua. And he, for most of my life, was an illegal immigrant. Now he's a resident alien. But he always wanted to go to school. I'm one out of 7 sisters. So I have 5 older sisters, 1 younger. And out of all of the daughters, I'm the most like my father. I like to study. He always wanted to become a medical doctor, but he was roofing for 45 years here. And before that, he was a migrant worker picking grapes up in Bakersfield area. So I have this in the background. I felt called to theological education at a very young age, at age 12. And I knew that, and I kept it to myself. Because if you go to ministry, why don't you just go to the Bible school, Bible Institute? But I knew that the Lord had put that in my heart to do, and I just kept on going through my education, even though now my father has come a long way. But he, like my church context growing up, they believed that women could function in the power of the Holy Spirit. But in praxis, as soon as they found a man who wanted to preach or wanted to lead a Bible study, they easily just replaced her. And so that's what I grew up in as a Pentecostal. And I know those services, but ours were 4 hours long. Now we're all dancing in the Holy Spirit. Anyway, that being said, they had no idea why I would even go to school for theological training, much less get 2 masters and a doctorate. By the time I left to Edinburgh, my dad said, well, you can teach your children, because that was where his worldview was at. But going back to we were talking about intercultural dynamics within the church. So that was, I know of how to start things in the church, but then once a man comes, then, step aside. I thought that in academia, that it would be a little bit more of a meritocracy, where you could actually be promoted because of your hard work and excellence in research. That's not always the case, especially as a woman of color. It's very, I'm at this place in life where I didn't want to believe that it was that bad. But then just witnessing it within the past 10 years, I've been a college professor for 12 years now. And I was an adjunct for 7 years. And I've been full-time assistant without any chance of tenure track for 5 years now. Just to see how time after time, men who are ABD, which is all but dissertation, get the job instead of me, even if I was 3 years out of a Ph.D. You know, it's just, that's the way it goes. Inside, outside church, it sometimes feels like seminaries and Christian colleges are behind, like maybe 30 years, even the academy. And so I know that by being within the academy, it may not change things at the rate that we want it to change, but at least they can't snuff us out. We have to remain strong and stay within it. But refuse. Okay, so may I tell you a personal story? Within the past 3 years, out of the 5 years that I've been at my institution, and I later found out in preparation for this, there's research to back up that this is a common practice, that because I was at the time the only woman of color in the institution, they gave me an administrative role to write policy for diversity and to be a diversity coordinator and liaison between administration and students. And basically they refused to hire a chief diversity officer. And they thought, well, you're diverse. Surely you know how to fix this. And so I worked very hard, and they actually were going to lose their WASP accreditation because it was such a bad problem at the institution. Last year, in the spring of last year, I finally confronted them and I let them know about the inherent racism of giving me this administrative role, especially without pay. Because there was no pay or compensation for what I did for them, but they got angry at me and going back, talking about white fragility, and they thought that they just hired a Latina to spice up the Bible program. But I found my voice, and thank God that I did, because I stood up to them because of the students, especially the students of color that they had no voice. Last spring was the time where we had invited a chapel speaker for Black History Month. And in the middle of the sermon, it was a dear friend of mine from seminary. A whole row of students stood up and called him the N-word. And nothing was done to those students. And yet with the students of color, there was rumor of them protesting, doing a silent protest. They got policemen and security guards and threatened them that they would be arrested if they had done that they demonstrated. So, it's really, this is real. And it is like a church context, and what makes it worse is that we're training pastors and we're training people who are treating the workplace as, ministry. I don't know if I answered the question.
That's all right. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you to both for sharing your stories. And it's just, even though I think our contexts are all very different and we have different experiences, it's also very striking to hear of similar themes arising in our contexts. So what I wanted to share was that, I'm going to try to speak a little more off the cuff, going in the spirit of the word, not the letter. But when I started my field education at seminary, I was a single woman, and it was at a second-generation Korean American church. And I think I was their first woman pastoral intern who did not focus on children or youth ministry, but who worked with college students and adults. My responsibilities included Bible studies, training lay people, and giving sermons on an occasional basis. So at our first all-church gathering that I attended, an adult male sat across from me, and he asked me directly, and without hostility, but with a questioning look in his eyes, "So, do you want to get married?" And I guess I assumed that he meant to a man, and I said yes, and we left it at that. But it reminded me that this wasn't the first time that I challenged, just by going to seminary, the relationship between heteronormativity and gendered ideas of faithfulness. So, like in other ecclesial settings, leadership for women in the Korean American church has often meant working behind the scenes in ways that kind of reinforce this latent belief that women are helpers. Yes. That their service comes from a place of either being a wife or mother, or ultimately becoming a wife or mother. It means complementing the more public work of preaching, leading worship, or teaching, by going through prayer, working in the kitchen, doing administrative work, doing the thousands of small things that need to be tended to so that churches can run. People will be open to collaborating with you only if you kind of seem to fulfill these two general categories. And one is that you offer to do these thousands of small things that need to be tended to. And then the other thing is you don't seem like you're too angry. That's right. So those are two things. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those two things. So you offer to do those thousands of little things, right? Because you want to be part of the conversation. Women, I think, generally speaking, and Asian American women in my own experience, are nurtured to provide for the other people in the room. And, I'm not saying that we shouldn't do this or that there isn't a place for it, but the problem is that this work has become naturalized as gendered female work.
Yes.
And because it's become naturalized, it becomes expected, and it becomes kind of part of the background. So I recently kind of stepped down as the executive director of a peer support group that I'm part of. And I had originally stepped into this role because I felt, and I knew that I could do a good job of organizing the annual symposium that we have, as well as manage the operations of the group. And I also felt like that maybe that it could be a space where I contributed my own scholarly perspective. But while I still do believe in the mission of the group and the value of having a kind of a peer support network for academics, I wasn't really able to contribute my own scholarship because most of my time was consumed with the former. Ultimately, I felt my work was invisibilized, not only because the actual service was not explicitly acknowledged until I brought it to others' attention, but also because I didn't have enough support in terms of my own research in that space. So what I realized from that experience was that service will always find ways to kind of infinitely expand for you in the space that you're in. Asian American women, they're seen as competent in areas of service and asked to serve in ways that won't recognize their own creative ecclesial or scholarly work. At the same time, I think that this in itself is feeding into how many Asian American women have been enculturated into serving, and how many Asian American women actually desire to serve because of how they've been the recipients of such service. So I don't want to say that service isn't important, but it's important that your commitment to service in this way is recognized by others as secondary to the work of preaching, teaching, or advocating in other ways. Or argue that such service is just as valuable as the work of teaching and preaching. Over and over again, I have seen this phenomenon of women serving and men sitting back, not maliciously or intentionally, but it does need to be called out. It's not just coming from those people who are hardcore complementarians, but also from those who are supportive of women's scholarship and ministry. Because many Asian American men and many men in general have also been nurtured to not do what's considered women's work. So I guess what I've been learning is to set the ground rules ahead of time and make these things visible before going into the work together. The other thing is that, the other challenge that I've observed is that the possibility to sort of be part of the conversation is only present if your politics on gender and sexuality and your personality align with some kind of ironic, like Christian ideal, like that you're kind of a peacemaker. So this is more subtle and maybe not so much based on like hard evidence, although I'm sure it's out there. But just an observation that I've experienced after serving in many different kinds of settings. So not only in terms of the substance of your own work, but your demeanor and your approach. So Asian American women are supposed to be nice and polite. It's why I resonated on some level with the comic strip by Lila Lee called Angry Little Asian Girl, because in her stories I found a cathartic release. We're supposed to be well-liked, to smile, to be modest and feminine in both subtle and overt ways, through appearance and dress, and the ways that you talk, and the things and the kinds of things or issues that interest you. So if you focus on feminist issues in a radical way, then you're not seen as a viable conversation partner because you're thought of being as too alienating. So radical can mean either like drawing upon resources that are not explicitly theological or methods that are not explicitly rigorous, or it can mean that you're critiquing things at the way things are done, or you're asking for more transparency. And sometimes you might get pushback from other people who say that those concerns are not relevant or that those things are secondary. And in those cases, sometimes you might find that you're shut out of future conversations or opportunities, which is hurtful, right? But I have been learning two things about myself when these things happen. One, shake the dust off your feet and move on. There are other opportunities, other collaborations that you can forge with people who are genuinely interested in making creative and power-sharing alliances. God is a God of generosity and not scarcity. And this is what we need to push into and remember in our context. Two, model the own transparency and power sharing that you yourself desire. Observe and learn from mentors who you admire and try to incorporate that in your own work. Check in with others through the process as an act of trust building. The goal isn't to be perfect and to model power perfectly, but to be open to transformation and the possibilities of surprising collaboration.
I noted in many of your comments, and probably just because of your context, we've been talking more in binaries. But as you discuss the kinds of intersectional challenges that you have encountered, I just want to add to that for our audience thought that we also have sisters who have other intersections that they have to deal with. Their sexuality, the threat that their sexuality brings to the workplace, to the church. For some, their inability to be open about who they are and in their relationships. And so if we are going to work together to overcome these dynamics, we as sisters have to be mindful to also support our sisters in their many diverse identities of sexuality and as well as race and culture. Class comes into play in certain churches. And so what I am reading between the lines, hearing you say from what some of you touched on, is that we also have to be those places of counter-narrative and to support one another in our identities and what we bring to the table, that we are not the whole of our sexuality, we are not the whole of our gender, we are not the whole of our race or ethnicity, but we are all of that and. So thank you for that important sharing. The last area that I would appreciate that you touch on deals with intergroup and intergroup dynamics among women of color. So intergroup, naturally, if you're Korean American, you have a natural inclination between family, friends, peers, to have a Korean group that you are engaged with. So how would you then also work with other groups, other identities? And then internal to our groups, that's the intra-group, there are dynamics as well among women of color. So please speak to our socialized and psychological conditioning of behavior dynamics across cultures and encounters. Now that's a very academic way of saying, why don't we get along? And how can we make the effort to get along? How, in your opinion, can we overcome these differences of, oh, those black women are too black, or oh, those Korean women just want to stay with themselves, too docile. And because of our presumptive stereotypes, we don't make the effort to cross boundaries and learn that we are, in fact, sisters.
May I? Well, what I found is that when there are fewer of us, basically we all know that we are the other, especially the higher up into the academy that you go. It's the otherness that brings us together. And the first time I was ever identified as a woman of color, because I was like, I'm off-white at best, was by, she was an Old Testament professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, named Mignon Jacobs. Powerful black woman, wonderful woman of God, hardest Old Testament teacher I've ever had in my life. And I have a lot of them. And she's the first person to ever identify me as a person of color. I was like, what? And she took me under her wing, and I'm still in contact with her. If she's modeled to me, she saw the need to be there for her sister. And I have not had any opportunities of Latina mentorship at all. And she saw that, and so she took it upon herself to do that. In fact, the first time I've ever been around a group of Latina biblical scholars was this past summer through the HTI, the Hispanic Theological Initiative. And it was a group of women at Princeton Seminary spending a week of research and interviewing each other, doing podcasts together, writing blogs together. And I felt it in my heart to write an article about the daughters of Zelophehad. I don't know if you are familiar with the story of the daughters of Zelophehad. For those who aren't, in Numbers chapter 27, there are these daughters, 5 daughters of Zelophehad. And they came together and they knew that they had the right to their father's land. They didn't have to have divine revelation. They didn't have to have divine validation or male validation. They knew that their inheritance belonged to them. And they came together and they told Moses to give them their inheritance. And Moses went back. The Lord told Moses, they are right. There are very few parts of Scripture that have God speaking directly to the prophet saying that people are correct. And this is one, and I guess the other one that you would have is Job, where God turns and says what Job has spoken is right, and had him intercede for his friends who were speaking wrongly about God. So, in the midst of us coming together as women, I realized that being around other women who knew their right to being who they are, it empowered me in ways that I'd never experienced before, And I think events like this. So either with I think the key thing is to identify your sister. You know, we're all daughters of the King. We all have our inheritance in Christ. And so if you see a sister struggling, doesn't matter. I mean, I think it starts there, whether it's within your cultural group or outside of your cultural group. So that's, I hope that helps.
So I guess I'm gonna just try to be real too. I mean, in terms of some of the things that I relate. Let me kind of just frame my remarks on this question in a few ways. First of all, you're right. Being a Korean American does not necessarily mean that I'm going to be kind of in the larger political project of being an Asian American, right? And so what has been so generative in my postdoc is to be situated in an Asian American Studies department and learning about other histories of other Asian Americans and the similarities as well as the differences. So I guess I'm not sure if I totally got the question correctly, but this is what I kind of was thinking through in terms of my remarks. So in that symposium that I helped to organize a few weekends ago, one critical part of our time together is to kind of workshop each other's ongoing works in progress. And so a white woman scholar, she had presented her ethnographic work on a Mexican-American pastorate and multicultural ministry, and the respondent was an African-American woman. So we had a good conversation around this particular work, but what struck me was one of the introductory remarks that the respondent had made. She said that part of her appreciation about reading this work was due to how it reminded her that there were issues of racialization outside of the black and white binary. So I could take that remark in two ways, right? So one, I could take it as an indirect affirmation that Latinx and Asian American narratives and concerns are invisibilized in larger racial discourses. For example, I could respond, of course there are issues of racialization outside of the black-white binary, and there are many, many scholars who are working on these issues. And to be honest, completely honest, as a scholar who tries to delve deeply into issues of Asian American identity in her work, in my own work, there was a part of me that felt a little slighted by her remark. Not because, I knew she wasn't speaking personally to me. That comment wasn't even about me, right? Even though I know that this scholar is committed to issues of racial justice in her own work and advocacy, and even though I appreciated her honesty, this feeling came from a longer history of experience, feeling like my own Asian American particularity didn't matter to me, didn't matter to anyone except for myself and other Asian Americans. And I also recognized in her remark that the academy shapes people into specializing into one's area of research. But I could also kind of understand this remark as part of the ongoing persistence of white supremacy, right? So there are histories of racialization that lend themselves to intercultural dynamics between communities of color, and which are often seeded by mistrust, right? So more specifically, Asian American women may be seen by other minoritized populations as complicit in the project of white supremacy by virtue of privilege and perception by whites. We are supposedly quiet, and physically, we don't seem to present much of a threat. We have been nurtured by many of our mothers to not take up space. So, not many people in the general population know about Asian American histories of trauma and exploitation, even though many of us benefit from those legacies today. The model minority trope is problematic for many reasons, but we also can't deny that it has also benefited Asian Americans, both on a personal and group level. In theological circles especially, Asian Americans and Asian American women in particular have not been historically nurtured to be political or vocal, but perhaps on some level, this is because we have attempted to reach for whiteness rather than question it on a systemic level. Because the stakes are high if we rock the boat. We have been told that it is better to be quiet and to share your worth through your performance. So I thanked my African American colleague after the workshop for her response, but I remained on the level of niceness, even though it was genuinely felt. I didn't have a conversation with her about how her comment made me feel. Not only because I had to run to tend to other things, but perhaps on a deeper level, I was afraid of not saying the right thing or being judged in my attempt of making a mountain out of a molehill. It was, after all, just one comment that she made among many others, and her comment was not about her ignorance, but more about my history of feeling invisible. Looking back, I think it was a missed opportunity that I could have perhaps built a bridge instead of remaining in my silo. Because on some level, the stakes felt high and the status quo felt easier. So I think that before we move to the rhetoric of solidarity between minoritized groups, before we can really achieve true solidarity between women of color, and I really am interested in hearing everyone's responses on this. We need to examine these different histories of racialization together, honestly and transparently. It requires acknowledging first, and I've been hearing this through the evening, that our histories of racialization are different. And it requires risking learning about a narrative that isn't immediately your own, a different genealogy. This different genealogy can be racial or of a different faith tradition. I think that white supremacy flourishes in the creation of silos, sometimes even twisting the deep work of excavation that is needed for our own communities into isolation. It twists that generative work into a narrative of scarcity, that there's only enough to go around for minoritized communities. So I really think that we can't achieve true solidarity without first recognizing that our stories are different. We can't proclaim solidarity without acknowledging how we have read and interpreted other minoritized groups in a way that proves them guilty before being innocent, and therefore a worthy ally. It means being open to the possibility that solidarity can look different for different groups of people, arising from our different histories of racialization. So this is something that I'm still working out in my own thinking and work, but I think that being an ally is less about replicating the particular modes of expression of other minoritized communities, and more about speaking to your own communities of color about different histories of racialization in their own modes of expression. But lastly, at the same time, be open to being surprised by and treasuring the fragile connections of resonance in those different histories. And promote and learn from the work of minoritized communities that are different from your own. So being an Asian American scholar and my colleague James Kyung-Jin Lee has spoken about how one is not born an Asian American, but is in the process of becoming Asian American. That ethnic identification doesn't translate to the political project of being Asian American. In a similar manner, I think that one isn't born into solidarity, but is always in process of being in solidarity because the lines of white supremacy and patriarchy are always shifting. In this process, vulnerability, accountability, and forgiveness on both ordinary and broader scales are vital in this process. Discomfort can be a holy space.
Yes.
But also seek to make the effort, like you are here, together to create oases of self-care and other care in this difficult work. Pay attention to how we have been trained to be self-possessed or contained, like I am reading from this manuscript, in a number of ways that aren't necessarily healthy or life-giving. And it's vitally important to intentionally and regularly connect with other people outside of social media, like we are today here this evening, and like you have been.
I feel incredibly privileged to have grown up, some part of my life here in Los Angeles and the rest in the Bay Area. So my entire life, I have been in spaces where, I've been engaged with diverse populations. And I've taken that for granted, as I've been in other parts of the country that are very segregated and homogenous. And I would even argue that Southern California and a lot of Northern California are very segregated. But I recognize how, it's it's easy to become siloed as we have experienced these other forms of oppression and marginalization. And that it's really critical to be challenged to resist the oppression Olympics, where our experience is more heinous and hideous than someone else's experience. And I've shared spaces with, you know, Black Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinx folks and Indigenous folks, where the fear was that because of, you know, maybe because certain folks felt alienated because they hadn't experienced the transatlantic, and, you know, or like feeling like we could always throw the slavery, you know, we could just throw that down and squash any conversation around, you know, whose intergenerational trauma was the most hideous and heinous. And so what I'm thankful, one, that I've been in, you know, spaces of education. I think being forced to be in school and being in fellowship and relationship with folks that are not only, you know, from your background, the advantage is that you are put in spaces where you're just in conversation, developing and deepening relationship with folks that aren't like you. And I don't mean that in a very, you know, I have Asian friends kind of way, but really deepening the relationship and actually learning from traditions and learning, you know, how other folks have lived and have suffered. I think as Christians, we are drawn together by the story of Christ's suffering, and we are often called into fellowship and relationship by our suffering. And so I have found that it's important to recognize and look at the ways that we have experienced suffering and also the ways that we experience triumph. And to just be intentional about it while recognizing that I can, you know, I'm 6 feet tall, so I'm sensitive to the fact that just showing up in spaces, you know, I'm the tall one. But also if I'm in a space where there are other, you know, folks that aren't, if we're celebrating being women of color, but there are more Black women in the room, how that can create a tension or a pressure for folks who are not Black to really claim and lay hold to their identity as women of color and to feel affirmed by Black women. And so I just want to say, I affirm you, I see you, and you know, you are not just tokenized in this space. I don't know if that was necessary to say, but I just felt compelled to say it. And have felt compelled to say that in other spaces as well. I have felt hurt, and I recognize as a leader, specifically in my work, I have felt the most challenged. I recognize something about myself, that I am the most challenged by my staff members that don't have a strong sense of their cultural identity. That, you know, I may have some folks on my staff, I'm thinking in particular of two, you know, mixed race, Mexican and white, you know, folks who are on my staff who, you know, they are very fair and they can navigate and walk through life looking very white and are celebrated by their families and, you know, they talk white, they act white, and I recognized how triggering that was for me because we do serve, you know, Latinx folks who have experienced all kind of craziness. And my first real, like, big challenge as an executive director, where I actually cussed out my board. You know, we had some tense moments of fellowship, but at the point where I lost it and actually like went after my board president, I tried to hold it down, but I just couldn't. I was like, Lord, help me with this, and I just couldn't. But when I took over the agency, I learned that there were 2 staff members from Mexico, one who barely spoke English, but that the 2 folks from Mexico were making $6 less per hour than their white counterparts. And so I was enraged, and I wasn't surprised, but I was enraged and offended and so angry. And when I took it to the chair, the chair was essentially saying like, well, I don't really know, you know, it's not, I mean, do we have the budget, you know, so, and so when she got it from me, I was like, you out your mind if you think I'm going to that I'm gonna be able to sleep at night, paying 2 staff members from Mexico.
Right.
Like, do you understand what that means? Like, this is so problematic, like, just on a generic PR level, and I just was so enraged, and I remember I was crying and frustrated, and I realized I just can't when it comes to that level of blatant discrimination and racism. And I've also felt pain at thinking, has anybody felt that angry and enraged about me as a Black woman?
Yes.
Like, how many, brown folks and Asian folks have I, put my butt on the line for and wondered if the tables were turned with that level of outrage and advocacy happen for me. When I'm out there, diving into the activism world or doing advocacy work, like, who's really the voice? And so I have to make sure that I intentionally stay away from that, but also am unapologetic about the fact that I'm always going to advocate for that level of, equity. I think equality is an interesting, it's an interesting term, but I think, equity. And then also, when I've looked at and interrogated the ways that us looking at how homophobia and transphobia has shown up in these spaces, how really even some of the advocacy work has really only benefited, cis men, white men anyway, but the more your identities are, intersecting, so if you're a queer person of color or a trans person of color, you're typically not at the forefront of this fight or the advocacy. And so I've been intentional about querying my own space to make sure that folks do not feel like they don't have a voice or that they are not seen or they do not have the same access to advocacy, resources, and love. Because I know full well, even though I'm an executive director, that I'm a called shepherd, and that the Lord called me there for such a time as this, to dismantle those types of things. But it's complicated and it's painful. I feel that it's critical that we are intentional about having conversations, that we provide space, that we, I've been intentional about being in spaces and calming my own voice, because I want to hear from one of my other sisters who may not feel like her voice is as loud or as important or as necessary as mine because I'm Black. And so I'm thankful that you're even opening up us having this, because no one's here to waste time, right? And so if we're here, as women of color, we really are here with the heart of being harmonious and acknowledging the fact that we are different. So I really, really appreciate the dialogue.
Amen. So let me just say, I'm going to be like the television stations, for those who are in the audience, for those who are in the audience and we have been filming so that they have benefit of seeing this, I want to ask you to give our speakers a big round of applause, because